Shalom Chavra, just wanted to share an interesting chiddush I had over Shabbos. So there's this interesting concept that pikuach nefesh is doche Shabbos, that for the sake of saving a life, you're allowed to push aside Shabbos. Gemara discusses it in Yom Daf Behei. And there is a discussion whether it's hutra or duchuya, meaning do we consider it to be a violation of Shabbos, or does Shabbos itself get pushed aside? It's not even like an avera, it's completely mutter, even a mitzvah. Now, an interesting question that I had is, what is the reason that for the sake of pikuach nefesh, we're allowed to override Shabbos? Meaning, put aside, no pun intended, put aside the question of hutra and duchuya for a second. Why? What's the svara? What's the logic behind our ability to push aside Shabbos for the sake of saving life? And I was thinking about it, and what is Shabbos? Let's get back. I know we've discussed this many times in the past, but let's quickly review. Shabbos is the ultimate paradigm of connecting the physical to the spiritual. So, for example, Oneg Shabbos, the enjoyment of Shabbos. You eat food, you sleep more, we engage in physical pleasure on Shabbos. What's going on? That's the deeper understanding of Neshama Yisera. There's this concept the Gemara talks about that we have Neshama Yisera on Shabbos. So a lot of people think that you have two Neshamas on Shabbos. Your weekday Neshama, you have an extra Neshama on Shabbos. But Neshama Yisera means more Neshama. It's not another, it's more. It's qualitative. It means that you are more soulfully able to engage in the physical world in an ideal and spiritual manner. Meaning that you're able to uplift physical engagement to an extent that you're not able to do during the week. Now, let's take a step further. You're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos. What we've talked about many times, malacha is not just something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Malacha comes from the shoresh malach. It's a creative force. What's malacha? Malacha is creative activity. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created malachim, creative emanations that come out of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Malacha are creative acts. We stop creating on Shabbos. Why? Because we experience the physical acts and creative acts that we've engaged with and accomplished during our life. In other words, we experience the unique relationship between our body and our soul, our consciousness, our inner selves, that we've manifested and created during our lives. Meaning, who are we? What have we done with the unique relationship that we as souls, as consciousness, as minds, as selves have engaged with our vessel, with our physical body? How have we engaged the world? And on Shabbos, we stop the creative activity and we experience who we are. Pikuach nefesh is not doche Shabbos. It's the ultimate kiyum of Shabbos. Because what's Shabbos? It's about the connection between the physical and spiritual. It's about making sure that connection is deeply rooted. What happens when someone's chas v'shalom in the state of pikuach nefesh, they're going to die? What happens when someone dies? Their soul, the spiritual, disconnects from the physical, their body. Why is pikuach nefesh doche Shabbos? It's not doche Shabbos. It's even more than hutra duchuya. It's a kiyum of Shabbos. Because by pikuach nefesh, you connect the soul to the body, which is the ultimate theme and ultimate purpose of what Shabbos is about. So let's take this a step further, because I want to delve into this for a few minutes. Because another way of thinking about this kiyum of connecting the physical and spiritual is another way of thinking of Shabbos, which is the seventh. The Maharal talks about this in many places, that the whole physical world is built off of sevens. You have 7 days in the week, seven lights in the spectrum of light, 7 notes in the musical scale. The whole world is built off of sevens. What's going on here? What's 7? So the physical 3-dimensional world is really not just 3, but 6. Why? Because you have right, left, up, down, forward, backward. That's 6. What connects the physical world together? It's the 7th. That's Shabbos. Shabbos is the 7th. It's that mystical oneness that connects the dimensions of the physical world together. What happens? Meaning, if Shabbos is the 7th, what happens when everything comes together? That's when you get the 8th. The 8th is that which transcends. It's the infinite. It's that which emanates from the physical pieces. So it's the soul that emanates, that's so to speak, transcendently connected to the body. Another way of thinking this, the Maharal talks about this in many places, is Torah. Torah is the 8th. That's why we received it on the first day of the 8th week. Matan Torah is the 50th day of the Omer, but it's the first day of the 8th week of counting. 7 weeks of 7, 49 days of Sfira, and the 50th is Matan Torah, which is really the 8th. Now, another way of approaching this is Hanukkah is the 8th. Why? Because Hanukkah, number one, the miracle of Hanukkah, not only do we have 8 days of Hanukkah, but the miracle happened with Shemin, the same as Shmona, 8. And what was Hanukkah? The Milchama for Torah. Torah over Greek ideology. Now that's why Bris Milah is Docha Shabbos. Another question, why is Bris Milah Docha Shabbos? Because not only is the 7th Shabbos is Docha Shabbos. Shabbos is, remember we're saying Pikuach Nefesh is the seventh. It is the concept of connecting the physical and spiritual, so it's Docha Shabbos. But not because it overrides Shabbos, because the kiyum of Shabbos, but Bris Milah is the eighth. It is the transcendent. It's not only the seventh, it's the eighth. So of course Bris Milah is Docha Shabbos, because it's, so to speak, the most spiritual, in terms of spiritual height, it's the highest. So it's, of course, Docha Shabbos. And that's very interestingly why, because what's Bris Milah? It's connecting the physical to a completely spiritual state. We take the most physical organ of the body and we give it a bris milah, a circumcision, saying that we're going to use that physical aver, the most physical aver of the body, for spiritual purpose. So it's really tapping into the same deep, powerful theme of what's Docha Shabbos. And I want just to do one last stage because this is such a powerful theme. And this is based on a very deep idea. The Sefer Yetzirah, in talking about the point of creation, talking about the Even Shasiya, the point where all of the physical world emanates from that creative point of creation. So he says that the seventh, the same concept of the seventh, is the point of creation. The point where the spiritual connects to the physical and where all of physical space and time comes out of. And the question, what does this mean, this concept of the seventh? So there's a mathematical paradox, and this is something which it's actually touched upon a bit in the Rambam and Rabbi Halevi and Al-Kuzari. But the basic notion is like this, and anyone in mathematics understands this point, and I'll explain to you very simply, that everything within a spatial dimension, it starts with a point. All of space has to start with a point. And the reason is like this, because you basically, let's start with this. Every line starts with a point, right? You have a point, and that point extends to a line. Now, to get a plane, two-dimensional, you extend the line. So now you have a flat surface, right? The point extended to a line, and now you extend the line. This whole flat surface now is a plane. You lift that plane up, and now you have a three-dimensional cube. So remember the same idea we talked about, a three-dimensional world is really six. You have right, left, forward, backwards, ups, and downs. So that starts with a point. Point extends into a line extends into a plane extends into a three-dimensional cube. But that point has no space. That point, that spiritual point, which the Sefer Yetzirah refers to as the Heichal HaKadosh. But that mystical point, that seventh, which we're going to talk about, the concept of how this whole thing stems from, both that unifying central point and also the starting point, it has no space. Why? Because if it had space, let's say that point had space, so it would be either, let's say it had a little bit of space, so it's a line, right? If you have two ends, it has to be a line. Or if it's a little, let's say the flat surface, a little more flat, it's a plane. It's really small, it's not extended yet, but it's still, I mean, you just zoom in and you get a plane. Or maybe it's a cube, maybe it's a sphere, or maybe it's a, you know what I'm saying? Like, you the moment you give it space, it falls into either being a line, a cube, a plane, some shape. So, and then it has dimensions. I mean, you're basically going back to the stage before you extend it into a line. So mathematically, it's a paradox. The starting point of space, the starting point of the line has no space. And mathematically, we don't understand, how is that possible? How can space come from something that has no space? And there's no answer, but that is the point. The paradox is that all of space comes from a dimension beyond space. And that the starting point of all logic and mathematics in the physical world stems from a place beyond space, beyond the physical world. And that is the meaning point of Shabbos. That is the seventh, the connection between the physical and spiritual, the transcendent and the immanent. I know this is very deep. I'll give you one last example, and we'll call it there. It's called Zeno's paradox. And it goes like this. Another manifestation of the same principle, which is that all movement makes no logical sense, because everything can be broken in half. Every let's say you have something that's 1. 1 can be broken into 0.5. 0.5 can be broken into 0.25. 0.25 can be broken into 0.125, etc., etc. It keeps on breaking down. Mathematically, every number, let's say one digit, one concept can be broken down infinitely into infinite parts. So that means that if two objects, let's say two, we'll call it two human beings, are 1 foot away from each other, then they can get infinitely closer to each other. Meaning, let's say person A wants to pass person B. So he'll get halfway closer. Now he's half a foot away, halfway closer, halfway closer, halfway closer, but ad infinitum, and he should never be able to pass the second person, ever, because he'll always get halfway closer. The fact that an object can pass another object makes no sense, because you should always get halfway closer. And that's where logic breaks down. That's where spiritual experience, that's where spiritual consciousness, that's where spiritual truth transcends logic. Logic is not the be-all and end-all. It's powerful, it's important, and it's an aspect of truth. It's not the whole truth. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created logic, but logic did not create truth. And that's the powerful notion of where Shabbos is that meeting point between physical truth and post-physical truth, post-rational truth, which doesn't erase logic, but shows that there's a hierarchy. And that's why Pikuach Nefesh, going back to how we started, is Docha Shabbos, not because it pushes aside Shabbos, because it's that ultimate synthesis, the ultimate paradigm of where we want to connect the spiritual and the physical. You connect someone's soul to their body. So let's be inspired this week. Let's bring Shabbos into the week. Let's connect every aspect of spiritual chachma, every aspect of spiritual consciousness, the passion, the idealism. When you understand and you're in touch with who you're meant to be, let's bring all of that into all dimensions of life. Let's live consciously, powerfully, and let's live passionately. An extraordinary life where we don't necessarily switch off between physical and spiritual, transcendent and immanent, but we infuse every aspect of life with higher consciousness, with passion and idealism. Have an amazing week.